Mr. Rasmussen, in your new book, The Will to Lead, you make an impassioned plea for the United States to show what you call determined American global leadership. What do you mean by determined and why now?
Yeah, determined means that you're really engaged, that you don't retreat, that it's not retrench, but the United States plays its role, as I also mentioned in my book, as the world's policeman. So determined in this sense of the word means that you're really engaged.
But why now? Why this plea now?
I think after 8 years with President Obama, we need a more engaged American president.
Well, we're going to have a new president. We don't know who it's going to be post-November, but regardless of who it is, there is a feeling that Americans are very weary of war. There is a feeling that America has limited financial resources, even though it's the world's largest economy, and more needs to be spent at home. How do you respond to that? And what do you see the role of its allies being?
I really think it's in America's self-interest to get engaged, because if the United States doesn't engage, then there's a clear risk that smaller conflicts would grow and eventually also reach the American shores. We saw that on the 9/11. We have seen that on other occasions as well. So my main argument is that it's in America's self-interest. Superpowers don't get to retire. They have to work. And that's what I would call the destiny of the world's biggest power.
I know, as you just mentioned, that only the United States can serve as the world's policeman. But we know also that we live in a multipolar world with conflicting agendas, and that the world is a much more complex place than it used to be. Given that, can America still impose its will on others?
I don't see it that way. I don't see the United States imposes its will on others. On the contrary, I do believe that America is the only power on earth capable to exercise that role as the world's policeman, and it is the only reliable candidate for that post. Of course, you speak about a multipolar world, but the fact is that you have only one superpower with a global reach. Then you have some regional powers like Russia and China, but no one would like either Russia or China to be the world's policeman. Only the United States has the capacity and the reliability to act like the world's policeman.
Now, part of your plea is because you believe right now the world is at a tipping point. And let me quote something from your book. When you're speaking of the Middle Eastern region, which is, of course, one of the most volatile regions, you write, quote, "Not since the Balkans a century ago has one region held so much potential for global disaster. Shia against Sunni, Russia against Turkey, Iran against Saudi Arabia, Islamic State against the West. Any one of these contests could provide the flashpoint for a global conflagration." Now that's a very dire warning. Can you expand on that?
Unfortunately, the Middle East is a mess. You describe it as it is. A lot of tensions. You have the social tensions because 2/3 of people living in the Arab world are under 30 years. Many of them don't have any jobs. On top of that, you have incompetent and corrupt governments. But even worse, you have the religious tensions between the Sunnis and the Shias. So we see the Sunni camp led by Saudi Arabia and the Shia camp led by Iran conduct proxy wars in the region, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, now maybe also in Libya. So that's why it's a mess. Actually, the only light at the end of that tunnel is the fact that the geopolitical importance of the Middle East will gradually fade away as the United States becomes more and more self-sufficient with energy.
You also maintain there is a link in your book between American reluctance to use firepower and what you call an outbreak of fire around the world. You just described some of the dynamics in the Middle East. But many might question whether military intervention always leads to better outcomes. For instance, Iraq, that led to ISIS. Afghanistan, Libya, just to mention 3 examples. So how do you respond to those critics who actually make a very valid point?
Yeah, I often hear those arguments, but the fact is that while, of course, military intervention won't always lead to a good result, the fact is, in these 3 examples, it was when the United States withdrew from those countries that problems started. Iraq, actually in 2011, it was a quiet country with good security. Then the Americans left and sectarian policies evolved, and that led to ISIS. In Afghanistan, exactly the same. When the international troops withdrew, the Taliban grew again. And in Libya, we conducted a 7 months very successful military operation. When we left, the problem started. So it's not because of the intervention, but because we left that the problems evolved.
Now in Syria, a human tragedy unfolding there that's had ramifications all the way to the European shores. And many people look at the Obama administration and feel that it made a mistake when it threatened military intervention if Mr. Assad crossed the red line on chemical weapons. He did, and then the US did not intervene. Are you in that camp that believes that was a major mistake? And do you think at some point the US will have to intervene militarily to find a solution there?
Syria is actually an example that inaction is also costly. You could mention all the examples of intervention and point to problems, etc. But Syria is a very tragic example of non-action. 250,000 people killed, more than 10 million people internally or externally displaced, refugees pressing Europe. So you have a lot of problems connected with this non-action.
Now you say, of course, the US is the only nation that can be the hegemonic nation, the world's policeman. Yet we have many allies. What is their role, and shouldn't they make a greater commitment militarily and financially? You know, a lot of Americans feel that it is not a level playing field.
Yeah, I understand that argument. I also agree with that argument, that in particular the Europeans should pay more for our common security. Today, out of the total NATO defense expenditure, the United States represent around 75%. That's quite a lot. So at the NATO summit 2 years ago in Wales, we decided, and all 28 NATO allies subscribed to that pledge, that within the next decade we will move towards 2% benchmark, which is that all NATO allies should spend at least 2% of their gross national product on defense.
Yes, but that's a pledge.
That's a pledge.
That's different than the actual money being there.
Yeah, that's right. It's a pledge. But the good news is that now 17 countries have increased their defense budgets in real terms. So I think 2015 represented the lowest level of defense investments ever in NATO. From now on, we will invest more, and we should.
We talk about the Middle East region and the conflicts there and their conflicts elsewhere. We haven't yet talked about ISIS and other non-state actors. This is something that wasn't in the Cold War period. It's a very tough enemy to fight because of the disbursement, because of lone wolf attacks, because of those who may not be formally linked, but have allegiance to those type of terrorist groups. What is the best way, you think, to fight this type of terrorism, and is the war really winnable?
Yeah, of course it's winnable, but I think you should use an appropriate mix of hard power and soft power. Hard power, you see that already exercised in the US-led air campaign against Islamic State, plus local ground forces. So that's the hard power. But in order to win hearts and minds in the longer perspective, you need some soft power measures, as for instance, I would call it a modern Marshall Plan for the Middle East to really help the Middle Eastern countries develop their societies.
But it's just not in the Middle East. Look at Brussels, look at Paris, look at what happened in San Bernardino, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And now you're back at the hard power measures. Obviously, we also need to strengthen our fight against what we call foreign fighters. That is better surveillance of their movements, more external border control, better external border control. I think as regards the European Union, the problem is that as long as you don't have an effective external border control, then the internal borders will always be disputed. And right now you see tendencies in the direction of a more closed societies.
In the Rasmussen worldview, what is the role of diplomacy and sanctions?
Well, first of all, let me stress, to use hard power, that is the military power, should always be the very last resort. So before coming to that, you should use diplomatic measures, eventually also sanctions. But I would say, to facilitate diplomatic solutions, you sometimes need to use your hard power. We have seen that in the past, that once you are threatening people with your hard power measures, the military measures, then people are more engaged in a political process. I'm very much in favor of the words of the late American President Ted Roosevelt, who once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick."
So for instance, Ukraine, with Putin's incursion there in the Crimea region, would you have used military power instead of sanctions? And what do you think Putin's end game is? And what's the best way to handle it? Because it's not only what's happening in Ukraine, but also what's been happening in Syria.
Absolutely. His end game is quite clear. He wants to restore Russian greatness. He wants to move Russia from a position of isolation into the board of directors, so to speak. That's why he attacked Ukraine. That's why he's keeping conflicts simmering or frozen in other parts of the near neighborhood, like Transnistria in Moldova, Abkhazia, South Ossetia in Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh, between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And that's why he started a military action in Syria. So his end game is quite clear. How should we counter that? Well, of course, no one has an appetite for a military confrontation. So That's why we have decided to introduce economic sanctions, and in my opinion, they should even be strengthened if he continues to destabilize the situation in eastern Ukraine.
Do you think he will?
So far, we have seen that he's quite scrupulous in his endeavors to pursue this end game of restoring Russian greatness. So I wouldn't exclude it, but so far, actually, we have seen some Russian reluctance to engage further, and I think that's because of our sanctions. That's also why the sanctions should continue and maybe be strengthened.
Earlier, you mentioned that you think only the United States can be the world's policeman, not Russia, not China. It is the hegemonic nation. But let's talk about China just for one moment, if we can, because we've seen the U.S. pivot towards Asia. A, do you think that is the right strategy? Two, we've seen a rise of Chinese nationalism and a rise of a Chinese military buildup.
First of all, I do believe it's the right strategy that the United States pivot to Asia, taking into account the Chinese endeavors to dominate the near neighborhood. I think it's the right strategy that the United States also engage in the region. But having said that, and while I do not underestimate the Chinese assertiveness, I still think China is basically a positive story. I do believe that the future lies in a constructive cooperation between the United States and China. China has an interest in economic stability in the world because the survival of the regime is very much dependent on continued economic growth. They are very much dependent on importing a lot of natural goods, including energy. To that end, they need a well-functioning free trade system. And finally, they are also very dependent on a transfer of new technology. And to that end, they need a good investment climate. They need foreign investment. So for all these reasons, I do believe the Chinese will choose a still stronger the United States instead of a declining Russia.
We live in very troubled times, and there is a general distrust of politicians. And as a result, there has been a rise in populism on the far right or the far left. What do politicians need to do to regain the public's trust? And doesn't that lack of trust make it that much more difficult for politicians to make very tough decisions?
Yes, indeed. It makes it more tough to take the necessary decisions. What should be done? I really think politicians should take people's concerns much more seriously. Take, for instance, the European Union and the refugee and migrant crisis. Much too long, the European Union has been focused on the free movement of labor across borders because it's definitely an economic benefit for all. But at the same time, we are now experiencing this pressure from outside. So we need a strengthened strengthened external border control to actually allow a free movement inside the European Union. And at the same time, I think the European Union needs a shot in the arm when it comes to the welfare system. What we need is a general qualification system so that you don't qualify for our generous welfare system unless you have worked and contributed to our society in 5 or 7 years.
You're the former Secretary General of NATO, so you have dealt a lot with military officials. Elected officials are different because they do have to answer to their public in a different way. Do you think in general that there is a lack of strong leadership today?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to accuse current political leaders for lacking leadership compared with previous political leaders. But it is clear to me that we need a very strong leadership, and we need that at a very global level, and that's why in my book I make the plea that the United States demonstrates this determined global leadership.
And finally, on the United States, it is the political season. Donald Trump is a presumptive Republican nominee, and of course, Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. From a foreign policy standpoint, your assessment of both?
Obviously, I'm not going to intervene into the American political debate, but you will see from my book that I'm very much in favor of what I call determined American global leadership. And based on what Mr. Trump has said so far, I don't think that he qualifies to live up to my expectations. So I'm not going to vote, of course, in the United States elections, but I will let my voice speak in favor of a president who will engage the US globally.
Even if it leads to outcomes that are not always satisfactory. Hillary Clinton, for instance, pushed in Libya, and look at the outcome there.
Yeah, but still, I do believe that the costs of inaction are much, much higher than the costs of action. And that's why sometimes politicians must take upon themselves the risk of making decisions leading to action.
Mr. Rasmussen, thank you so much for your time. Best of luck with your book.
You're welcome. Thank you.